As of November 2020, there are approximately 1.5 million podcasts. And even though only half of them are actually active, breaking into this medium can still seem daunting. You're literally one in a million. But don't let that discourage you. Hi, I'm Alicia Butler-Pierre, and in this live consultation, you're going to learn firsthand what it takes to start a podcast. You might be surprised to see how similar it is to starting a new business. That's what today's guests are about to discover. They've recently started a new nonprofit, and they want to leverage a podcast to help spread the word about its mission to support entrepreneurs. Let's see what happens when 3 engineers by trade and an attorney put our heads together to design something spectacular. This is Season 10, Episode 123. Let's start the show. This episode is brought to you by RVidi, and it's an app that allows you to be the director of your own show. And we'll explain exactly what that means in just a few minutes. But first, joining me today, I'm joined by a lovely trio of ladies here. Also in the Atlanta, Georgia area, we have Karen Mills, Cynthia Culbreath, and Deborah Bailey. Welcome, ladies. How are you today?
Thank you.
Great.
Glad to be
Thank
here.
you.
All right. I know this is a highly anticipated podcast, thanks to Karen. But not just because of Karen, because seriously, people ask me about podcasting all the time. And although we won't be able to cover everything, I think we're going to get through a good part of how to just set up your podcast. But before we start talking about any of that, I'd love for each of you to introduce yourselves and then tell us about this exciting nonprofit organization that you're starting. So who wants to go first? Okay, I thought you were all type A personalities. That's
We
what
are.
Karen said.
We are.
Okay. So don't all speak at once. Do I need to pick someone? Deborah, let's start with you. Uh-oh, Deborah, your sound is off. Are you muted? We're doing this live. This is what happens. So let's let Deborah figure that piece out. Cynthia, what about you?
Sure. My name is Cynthia Culbreath. I live in Noonan, Georgia. I am a double jacket graduate of Georgia Tech in Industrial and Systems Engineering. I've worked in corporate America for about 24 years. And then about 18 months or so ago, I decided to step out on my own and start my own company, my own small business. So yes,
Good
big
for
step,
you.
but I'm excited about that. It's called A Wonderful Change. I've known Karen since I was a freshman at Georgia Tech. So when she came to me with this potential opportunity to start a nonprofit, I had to say yes because we both have a passion, along with Deborah, for helping other small business owners. So this sounded like the right thing to do and the right time to do it.
That is awesome, Cynthia, and welcome. And congratulations on taking the entrepreneurial plunge.
Thank you.
I'm sure it's been a labor of love, right?
Yes, labor and love, both very accurate words.
Karen, what about you? Tell us about yourself.
All right, I'm Karen Mills, and I am the managing member of the boutique law firm Mills Law LLC, based in Atlanta, Georgia, where we specialize in corporate transactional, contracts, and business law. I like to say we do everything from helping you form the entity to selling the entity, and a lot in between. And a lot in between is usually contract review, negotiation, and drafting. I have an undergraduate degree in electrical engineering from Georgia Tech. I worked as an engineer for about 4.5 years and then quit and went to law school at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. So I've been practicing law now for almost 21 years.
Wow, Karen, you just roll that off the tongue. I love it. And Karen,
20
everybody.
years of practice.
Years ago, I attended a workshop where Karen spoke, and it was so action-packed and full of information, and I kept those notes. Karen, I don't know if I ever shared that with you or showed you what those, I still have those notes. I scanned it and everything. Yes, it was about teaming agreements.
Yes.
So, yes. So Karen is an awesome presenter. Now, Deborah, we got your sound back on?
Got my sound back on.
Okay,
Ready
awesome.
to go.
Yes, let's hear from you.
So I'm Deborah Bailey. I'm the managing member of Bailey Helms Legal. We are a real estate transactional law firm. located in Roswell, Georgia. I've been in the practice for about 19 years in Georgia. I'm also licensed in the state of Florida, but most of the work that I do actually is in Georgia. About 3 years ago, I made the entrepreneurship plunge and started my own law firm. And prior to that, I worked in firms since law school. And before law school, I had a career as a banker on Wall Street. So this is actually a second career for me.
Wow. I am so honored to be in your presence, ladies. Oh my gosh, we have 2 engineers, a former banker on Wall Street, 2 attorneys, a lot of brain power on this call. So please tell us about your new nonprofit organization.
Okay, I guess I'll start. It's the Business Action Alliance, Inc. It's a nonprofit alliance that's dedicated to educating and empowering business owners and entrepreneurs on key basics in the areas of legal, risk management, and contract compliance so that they can build a solid business foundation for growth and sustainability.
And you are speaking my language, Karen, here on the Business Infrastructure Show. We're all about sustainability and scale and foundation and having those processes and systems in place. And speaking of processes, one of the things that you all are looking to do fairly quickly is start up a podcast, right? And will that
Absolutely.
podcast be an extension of Business Action Alliance?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so
Perfect.
that's the idea, is to take some of those basics that we've been talking about and actually have them available for the world to see through the podcast.
That is awesome. And so we're definitely going to talk about that. And one of the things that Karen and I did in preparation for our discussion today is we use this app called RVidi, and RVidi is our sponsor today. And what RVidi does is it allows us to communicate to each other privately using these short video sound bites. So in 30-second clips, Karen was able to submit what the idea was, what she wanted to talk about very specifically on the podcast. And then I, in turn, was able to respond. We merged our videos together and it produced what you're about to hear right now.
Hello, my name is Karen Mills, and I'm one of 3 founding members of the Business Action Alliance, or the BAA. The other founding members are Deborah Bailey and Cynthia Culbreath. Now, collectively, we have over 80 years of combined experience in the fields of law, finance, manufacturing, human resources, and engineering in Fortune 500 companies, nonprofits, and as entrepreneurs. We came together under a common desire to provide entrepreneurs and business owners with access to high-quality services to build a solid business foundation. The BAA provides practical resources and solutions in distinct areas, including legal, risk management, and contract compliance. To spread our back to basics message to a broader network, we want to launch a podcast where we break down fundamental tips and lessons learned, not just from our experiences, but from others in our vast network. The goal is to help entrepreneurs and business owners grow and sustain their businesses. Right now, we have the skeleton of the concept and some potential episode topics. We need help with how to prepare and launch. We want to make sure we have all of our bases covered from a content and technical perspective. We are 3 type A personalities, so winging it is definitely not an option. Please help.
Karen, I'm so excited. We finally have the opportunity to talk in depth about podcasting. So I can't wait to have this conversation with you and your business partners. Before we get into the day-to-day mechanics of what it takes to actually produce the podcast and some of the promotional things that take place afterwards, I want you to first think about these 3 things. 1, who is your target market or target audience for your podcast? The second thing to think about is the frequency of your show. Have you all given any thought to how regularly you would want your podcast to be featured? Is it daily, weekly, bi-weekly, monthly? And lastly, have you and your business partners thought about how to divvy up or divide the work that it's going to take to produce the podcast at whatever scheduled frequency you've thought about? We'll talk about those 3 things plus so much more when you all come onto the podcast.
Ready.
Okay, they are ready. They have their notebooks ready, and we are back. So listening to that video exchange between myself and Karen, we're going to talk about podcasting, and there's so much to say before we even get to promotions, because we likely won't get to promotions, or at least not take a deep dive into promotions. But let's definitely talk about the things that you need to think about in terms of setting up your podcast. So we're going to start from the very, very beginning. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share my screen because I've prepared something to help facilitate this conversation. Can you all see this?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so what I have pulled up on the screen, for those of you listening to the podcast only, and you don't have the benefit of seeing the video right now, I have this slide up called Podcasting Setup, The Basics, and it's a series of different questions in the form of a checklist as well. So one of the very first things, and this was actually something that I mentioned in my video response to Karen, is who is your target audience? So what we're going to do, this in the process of answering these different questions, you all are literally going to start developing this setup process. And so your process might not look like a traditional standard operating procedure or a flow chart, but it could just be this checklist that you use as a launching pad to get started. So again, going back to that very first question, who is the target audience for your podcast?
Deborah?
Yeah, our target audience is actually the entrepreneur or business owner in the startup phase to the growth phase of their business cycle. So that's the person we're targeting.
Okay, so startup phase to growth phase. Are you specifically targeting entrepreneurs in a certain industry?
No, across the board.
Okay. And are they faced with a particular problem or challenge that you are seeking to help them solve?
Yes. What we see is far too often the entrepreneur, small business owner, they're so focused on the business that they forget about there is actually a business of being in business. So there's that professionalism element that needs to go along with whatever they're doing. And we see that playing out, for example, in the COVID crisis, where so many businesses just weren't able to document the business side. And as a result, they weren't able to get a lot of the PPP money that was circulated. And what we think is by having these basics in place, we hope that this will not be duplicated in the future.
That is so needed. And unfortunately, these kinds of things fall on deaf ears, and it's not until you actually need it that people realize why it's so important. So kudos to all of you for putting something like this together. Now, next question. Have you thought about the structure or the style of your show? And what I mean by that is it going to be educational? Is it going to be, have some comic relief every now and then? Is it really going to be you being on video as well as having the audio? What is the structure or the style that you think your show will be structured as?
Well, I think in terms of the structure, I think we would want to be on video. Our mantra as we've gotten started has always been back to basics. So we want to have like real talk conversations with the audience. And we all have a vast network of other people that we've worked with before that kind of share our same sentiments. So we'd invite other guests to come in and talk certain topics, but we kind of think that we're closet comedians. So we want to be able to let our personality shine through. So, that
That's
sounds like the
good.
start of a bad joke. Two lawyers and an engineer walk into a room. Yeah.
You know why that's so important, Cynthia? I'm so glad to hear that you want to have humor as part of your style, because these topics aren't necessarily considered quote unquote sexy.
Exactly.
Right. And
yeah.
so anything that we can do to spice it up, to make it a little different, to make it interesting and fun and entertaining is definitely appreciated. So what about the frequency? So that's the next question on this checklist here. And what I mean by frequency is, have you all thought about how often you want to produce these podcast episodes?
Well, we were thinking possibly bi-monthly at the onset because, and then with the thought that it could be adjusted based on the audience demand, because we know that everybody's schedule is so busy, doing so much stuff right now. But I think we are really committed to at least trying bi-monthly initially.
Okay. Okay. And what about the length? What length are you aiming for initially?
Ladies, were you thinking, I mean, would it be, is typical about an hour? Because I'm trying to, because with legal and risk management and contract compliance, those can be such heavy topics. But it may take a good bit to be able to break it down into the basics so that the audience can really understand it. Because what we don't want to do is, I have the cases where people feel that they're being talked down to. We want to make sure that we break it down so that they clearly and can easily understand certain of the things that we are trying to convey to them.
Sure. So are you thinking 30 minutes maybe would be good enough to not overwhelm people, or an hour? So here's the thing about a podcast.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
It's just like if you write a book, it can be whatever you want it to be. It can be 30 minutes. You can do like Joe Rogan and have a 3-hour show.
Yeah, that
I
would
know.
probably
I was like, whoa.
not be the direction that we would want to go.
But the point is, that's the beauty of it. It can be whatever you want it to be, as long as there is an audience for it and you're having fun and people are actually learning, which is the intent in the first place. That's what matters. How you deliver it over time. I think, Karen, you're onto something. Over time, you will understand whether people want to hear this more than bi-monthly. They want it to be weekly. You may even get to a point where they want to hear it every Monday through Friday. That's a whole nother conversation.
Yes.
That's when your podcast would literally become a business, like seriously. And there, you may even figure out that there are some ideas for some spin-off shows. I know several people, they have, I don't know how they do it. Well, they do it full time. That's how they're able to pull it off. But I know people who have 6 and 7 podcasts running concurrently.
Ooh.
Yeah, but it's what they do for a living. So you literally
Okay.
do have professional podcasters. That is literally how they make their money and how they sustain themselves. It's their business. That is the business model. Speaking of business model, that's not a question on here, but it actually is something to think about when it comes to the monetization piece. Have you all given any thought to that right now? I know that might be a fairly premature question, but just to give you an idea, the traditional ways of monetizing a podcast are sponsorships and advertising. I'm also a huge advocate of using your podcast as a business development tool. So it could be, and some people also have the guest to client conversion model, meaning they intentionally invite guests onto their podcast that with the sole purpose of being able to convert those guests into clients. So that's another approach that you can think about. And I know that might take a little bit more thought, but I just wanted to put that out there, that the business model, because literally this is an extension. It seems like it's just a little attachment to your nonprofit, but you'll quickly learn it's gonna take on a life of its own at some point. The more you keep doing it and the more you start to gain traction, the more the bigger your audience grows, the more attention you start getting. Again, you may find that bi-monthly people actually want it weekly, maybe even daily. Let's go on to the next question. And actually, you've already answered this, which is whether or not you want to have guests on the show. And so you've already answered that question. Are these going to be other subject matter experts that you're thinking of inviting onto the podcast?
That was our initial thought is, Karen and Deborah have specialties in the areas of law that they do, but if there's a question that comes up about something else, then we want to bring people in who could be a subject matter expert on that particular area, for example. Or we can give some basic information on one thing, but if we want to build on that and say the next step after you build this foundation is to go here, then we can have a guest to come and talk about that.
Okay. And so I'm sure you already know that that requires a little bit more planning and preparation. So
Absolutely.
you'll have to think ahead of time of your podcasting schedule.
Hmm.
So what I do, and it's just something to think about, you know those large desktop calendars that you buy at an office supply store like Office Depot or Staples?
Right.
And they're very inexpensive. Usually you can get one for just $5. But I literally write down when each episode is going to come out or when I expect to have each episode come out. So for example, my show comes out every Sunday. And so I know at least 2 months in advance what I want the episodes to be about and who I might need to start inviting as a guest. You have to line your guests up very early because people's schedules, especially right now with COVID, people's schedules get booked very quickly, especially depending on how much of a hot commodity your potential guest is.
Gotcha.
So the more popular your guest is, the more in advance you might have to actually book that person, a date and time for that person to be on your show. Another thing, this is another tidbit, try to record your episodes in batches. That way you're not scrambling at the last minute looking for a guest. If you try to do, let's say, in the month of, we're in September right now as of this recording, September 2020, I can tell you right now, your episode will not go live until late November 2020. But look, it's September and we're doing your episode. So you don't want to get yourself in a position where, again, you're scrambling at the last minute, trying to look for material, trying to line up different guests. Try to get them booked as soon as you can. So any questions about that so far?
No,
Okay, perfect.
Sounds good.
Deborah, you've been a little quiet there.
I'm listening.
Okay.
Right.
Taking it all in. Okay, gotcha.
Yes.
Now, the next question, distributor. Do any of you know what I mean by that? Okay. So here's, when you have a podcast, there are distributors of that podcast. There are companies like, for example, Libsyn, Libsyn. It stands for Liberated Syndication. I believe they were the very first podcast hosting / distribution platform out there. There's also one called Anchor. There's a number of them.
Okay, I've
But
heard of Anchor.
Yes, Anchor, and Anchor is free. What happens with these distributors, you decide which of those distributors you want to form a relationship with as it relates to your podcast. You create an account with that distributor, and then when you create that account, they're going to assign you an RSS feed. Once you get that RSS feed, you then use that to push your podcast to all of these other platforms, such as SoundCloud, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, Google Play. Oh my gosh, there's so many of them. iHeartRadio, TuneIn, Radio Public. I mean, you name it. You need that RSS feed. And once you develop that relationship with that distributor, that's one of the first things that you'll get. Now, just know when you first sign up and you tell them, this is the name of my podcast, this is how often you're going to provide basic information about your podcast, who the authors are, which would be the three of you, and some other information. They're going to give you an RSS feed. It can be a few days. Sometimes it can be up to 24 hours. I think maybe sometimes as long as 72 hours. Just know that there are also certain networks where they want to see that you have skin in the game. So they're not going to accept your podcast right away. iHeartRadio is one of those platforms. I think you have been podcasting for at least 6 months before you can submit your podcast to iHeartRadio and they start carrying it as part of their network. So that's what a distributor is. And I actually have a chart that I want to share with you after we go through these different questions so that you can visualize and picture exactly how that network and ecosystem actually works. So just know for now that you have to think about which distributor that you want to work with. Another question, will you all have, obviously you're going to have a website for your nonprofit organization. Will your podcast episodes be featured on your website for the nonprofit? So for Business Action Alliance, will you have a tab that says, for example, on the main menu, podcast?
We have our designer reserving a space for that right now.
Okay, perfect. Because something else that some people do is they create a completely separate website for their podcast. But know this also, many of the distributors like Anchor, for example, they will actually also give you your own dedicated page. So even if you aren't able to get your podcast up and going on the Business Action Alliance's website, just know that when you're first starting out, you can still point people to a page on Anchor. So it might be anchor.fm/Business Action Alliance podcast, or whatever the name of your podcast is going to be, which should be a question on here. You definitely have to
That's
have
what I was about to say. I have that. I have that written down.
Okay. What's the name of your show? Have you thought about that?
We thought about it, but I kept researching and a lot of the names are taken because we really wanted to go with that back to basics mantra somehow.
Mm-hmm.
But there are so many listed that back to basics with blah, 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 blah. So I don't know if that's going to be something unique enough, to get us some traction.
Right. And I would say also, when you think about your name, make sure that it's intuitive for a person who, let's say, if I have my phone here, I have an iPhone. And so with iPhones, there's the Apple Podcasts app. And if I go to that app, I can just search by a topic. I can search by a category of podcasts. Will your podcast name come up in a search? So if it just said back to basics and there was nothing in there about business, would it come up in someone's search? So just keep that in mind. And think about some of the podcasts that you really like and really pay attention to the name of the podcast. Some podcasts, they just have the benefit of having celebrities. So they don't have to, they don't have to think about all of this stuff that we're talking about right now. They already have the benefit of being famous. And it's just a matter of them telling the world, hey, I started a podcast. This is where you can find it. And they're done. I'm on Spotify now. This is where you can find me. But for those of us who are not celebrities, who have to work harder, but we're all going to become famous though, right?
That's right.
That's right. So we just have to work a little bit harder, but we're getting there. But seriously, think about that. Or it could be that Back to Basics is the main title and you have a subtitle. Something that says, business, blah, blah, blah. Like my podcast, it's called the Business Infrastructure Podcast, but the subtitle is Curing Back Office Blues. So I'm letting you know this is about the back office. This is about operations. A lot of people hate to talk about it. I don't want to deal with processes. Alicia, why? No, it's so boring. But I'm letting you know that's what this show, just in the title and subtitle alone, you have an idea of what it's about. Now, cover strategy. What I mean by that is, not only do you have to have a name for your podcast and think about all of these other questions that we've just discussed, the target audience, the structure, the style, the frequency, the length, will you have guests? You have to have a podcast cover designed to accompany your podcast. So again, whatever platform, for those of you who are listening, wherever you consume your podcast, for me, I just go to my Apple Podcasts app on my phone. But there are some people who may they may search online, or they may go to a network like an iHeartRadio, and they may say, okay, well, I'm looking for a podcast that deals with spirituality. And they may type in the terms, the keyword spirituality, and you're going to notice all of these covers that pop up. What's going to stand out to people? Always think about that. You have to think about the color scheme that you want to use. Will all three of your headshots be on the cover? Will it just be some creative artwork that you'll use? What is that cover going to look like? Because that cover is so important, because you have to remember, as people are searching, the results, they're going to see a sea of all of these different tiles, if you will, or covers. What's going to draw them to your cover? Not knowing who Karen, Cynthia, and Deborah are, what's going to attract them to your show based on the cover alone? It's the same principle as a book cover. People will judge based on the cover. So just that's what I mean by the question cover strategy. Description. When you create your account with your distributor, they're going to ask you, what is the description, Deborah, of this podcast? And they'll usually tell you how many characters. You can't go over, I don't remember off the top of my head. It's probably, I'll tell you this. I know this for a fact because we deal with it every single week. When we release a new podcast episode, it tells us very specifically, this description of this episode cannot be more than 512 characters for Apple Podcasts. Everybody else, they may cut it off. They may include the whole thing. So just use that as a rule of thumb. Again, the idea is to be concise and succinct in your description. Now, what I just described is a description per episode, but you're going to have a description for your overall podcast. And that's your opportunity to tell people, once they do a search, they're intrigued by your podcast cover. So they tap on your podcast cover. What is the description that they're going to read that's going to make them say, wow, oh my gosh, I need to save this podcast. I need to subscribe to this podcast right now and start downloading these episodes. So what most people will put in their description of their podcast, obviously, is it answers some of these questions. Who is this podcast for? How often can I, as a listener or a subscriber, expect to receive updated episodes? What is it? What type of podcast is it? Am I going to learn something? So it could be the Back to Basics podcast is a weekly show, a bi-monthly show that delves into the details of what it takes to make sure your business is in order, so forth and so on. We have special guests that we invite on. You will be sure to gain knowledge and know exactly what you need to do to keep your business in order and not ever be caught off guard. Something like that. But it's, again, just making sure it's answering, the who, what, when, where, why, and how of your podcast. Again, in a few short sentences. And what happens is when you create that account with that distributor is going to push your podcast cover and your description to all of those networks that you tell it you want it to go to. Now, the last question I have here is promotion, because that's the hard. I always tell people, doing the episode itself, that's the easy part. You know your stuff, right? I mean, you're all very, very, very brilliant women. So you know these topics like the back of your hand. And you can I know Karen just rolled off, she just rolled everything out when she was speaking earlier. That's how you're going to be on your podcast. It's just going to come so natural for you. The hard part, I won't even say is in prepping for it. It's the promotion of it. Because you have to promote it hard. There's a million podcasts out there. About half of them are active podcasts, meaning they're actively generating content. Some podcasts, and remember how we were saying that podcasts can be whatever you want them to be?
Yes.
One of my favorite podcast networks is Wondery. So Wondery. Some of their podcasts are only 6 or 7 episodes. It's telling a story. For example, there's one called The Shrink Next Door, about this man who literally signed over everything he owned to his psychiatrist. And it took him 30 years to figure out what had happened to him before he finally snapped out of it. It's fascinating. It's just 7 or 8 episodes. That's it. That's the podcast. And then there's another one called Dr. Death about a neurologist in Dallas, Texas, who he's in jail right now, but he injured most of his patients, well over 80% of his patients. And they were trying to figure out, is this intentional or is he just that incompetent as a physician? So those are the types of podcasts they have, but they do have some like Business Wars, for example, which is probably one of my favorite podcasts, where it's an ongoing podcast and is structured into seasons, and every season features a different war. So for example, the one I'm listening to right now, the season I'm listening to right now is FedEx versus UPS. There's another one called Starbucks versus Dunkin' Donuts. There's one about the game of Monopoly, how that came about. Karen, you would love that, especially from an IP perspective, because the story that we were all told by Parker Brothers, that is not how the game came together. It turns out it was a woman who created Monopoly.
Wow.
Really?
Yes. So shout out to the Business Wars podcast.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating podcast. Another podcast that I really like is NPR has some great podcasts. That's another place to go, just in terms of seeing a model of how they describe their shows, what the podcast covers actually look like. Again, keep in mind it's NPR, so they already have a very strong brand behind them. But look at some of those networks just so you can start seeing what, for you as a visitor to NPR's website, what's attracting you to certain podcasts more so than others. And just keep those things in mind and apply it to your artwork for your show as well as your description. Now I'm sorry, does anyone have a question at this point?
So
Okay.
I have one
Yes.
back on the business model. So would you recommend doing like a hybrid? I know you talked about sponsorships and we had talked about that as well, but the whole guest to client conversion, can you do both?
You can do whatever you want to do,
Because
Cynthia.
it's our podcast.
That's right. It's literally like you started, you're still fairly new in business. It's the same thing. It can be whatever you want it to be. It can be all of the above. You can have sponsors, you can have advertisers. Now, I will say this about advertising. They want to see thousands of downloads usually. A sponsor, so for example, with RVD is sponsoring this episode. We developed a relationship where Janice Jensen, the creator of the RVD app, with sponsors, you want to show that you actually promote their product, that you're trying to actively use their product or their service. And so one of the things that we did that's very different, just so you'll know, this is the first time we've ever asked people to submit a video as part of the quote unquote guest application or intake process. Usually it's just a form. Usually on the website, you would just see a form. And it would ask you very basic things. What's your first and last name? This is the season that we're about to interview people for. Which topic would you like to talk about that aligns with the theme of this season? What's your website's URL? And then you click submit. And then I in turn receive an email with those responses. I look over it. And if it seems to be a great fit and it's in alignment with the theme, I then just send that person a link where they can book a date and a time for the interview, and we're done.
Okay.
So we did something different this go around because of that sponsorship with
Gotcha.
RVD. Okay, so we talked about these basics. Let's talk about something else really important. So you're setting up all of the things for, what it's going to take to actually get your podcast set up online. But now let's talk about what it takes to actually start podcasting, the equipment. So have you all thought about that?
We thought about it and thought we needed to ask you what you thought.
Great
But you
answer.
know, but I remember talking to Alicia a long while ago about this, and I did purchase that Yeti microphone because she told me that. So I
Yes.
do have the Yeti
Yes, and
mic.
I have one too because
Right.
Karen told me that. Yes.
Right. So I do remember that. I do have a Yeti microphone. So I have that. We have that ready. Right.
Now make sure you get a filter
Okay.
because that's going to filter the weight when you say your S's,
Okay.
like Sally sells seashells by the shore,
All
and
right.
your P's, being a perfect patty baking pumpkin pies. So you'll notice a huge difference when you have, so you notice here, so this red arrow here, that's that filter.
Okay.
And then, of course, this is your mic. Let me just say, ladies, I had no idea what any of this stuff was. I was so clueless. When I first started my podcast, we were literally using freeconferencecall.com. Seriously. Then I started using Zoom because the sound, as you can imagine, was not up to par because it was via the phone. So then I started using Zoom. And even with Zoom, here's something that one of my podcasting buddies, his name is Doug Sandler. Shout out to Doug. His podcast, Doug has a very popular podcast. It's called The Nice Guys on Business. So if you go to niceguysonbusiness.com, you'll see his website. Now, Doug has $1 million. He's $1 million podcaster.
Okay.
He podcasts Monday through Friday. He's one of those people that I know that has like 5 or 6 podcasts.
Wow.
Yeah, so he does it for a living. So his model, his business model is that guest to client conversion business model. But one of the things, it just goes to show how, when you don't know what the heck you're doing, oh my gosh. So when I bought, let me just explain the phases that I went through. So first we were doing freeconferencecall.com. I was also on Anchor, and I started having issues, honestly, with Anchor. I tell people there's a cost for free. I'm sure it's gotten better, but I eventually transferred my podcast over to Libsyn.com. And I haven't had any issues with Libsyn. So then I started using Zoom. And then Doug said, well, the quality, Alicia, still isn't there because I was just using my headset with the mic that comes with the headset. That still isn't the best sound quality. So you really need a microphone. But I'm sharing all of this with you to let you know this didn't happen overnight. I didn't go out and buy all of this equipment when I got started because I didn't want to make the investment, to be honest with you, because I thought I would just podcast. I would do it for a couple of months and then okay, that was fun. That was interesting. Let me try something else. But 2 years later, I'm still doing it. And so you just keep in that spirit of continuous improvement, you just keep upgrading along the way. And so I eventually did buy this Blue Yeti mic, but here's something else. Doug had to tell me that my mic was turned backwards. I had to turn backwards for a good 6 months because he was like, the sound quality. He was like, okay, I see your mic. And we were using Zoom and he said, Alicia, your mic is turned backwards. I was like, oh, okay.
I love it.
I didn't know what a boom arm was, like this thing here. I didn't know what that was. I went to Micro Center. Are you all familiar with Micro Center?
Mm-hmm.
And I said, I need to buy a microphone. And they said, okay, well, do you need a boom arm with that? I'm like, a what? A boom arm. What is that? And they had to show me. And I was like, oh, okay. So then I got home and then my husband and I were trying to figure out how in the heck do we even assemble this and put this together. So I had to I would have to go onto YouTube and watch how other people assemble things. It was crazy because none of these things come with instructions and you're just trying to wing it and figure it out, on your own. One other thing, I had mentioned Zoom. Another point I wanted to mention, something that Doug had to tell me. On Zoom, when you go into your settings, if you click on the record setting, there's an option to record separate audio files for each speaker. Please select that, because he was telling me that allows your editor to actually manipulate the volume. Let's say if as we're talking, I can tell you right now, it's going to produce the minute we end this Zoom call, it's going to produce 4 different audio files. That will be turned over to the editor. And then if somebody's sound is just a little bit lower than maybe everyone else's, the editor can at least isolate that one particular person's audio file and try to get it up to a volume that's on par with everyone else.
Okay.
Okay.
I didn't know that either.
Okay.
So
Good to
yeah,
know.
this is
Thank you for
this
sharing.
these are all
Great
things.
tips.
Listen, I've been
That's
going to
awesome.
all of these conferences and these workshops and networking with other podcasters and trying to, literally stumbling my way around until I finally figured it out. And there's still so much more to learn. The other thing is your headset. Something else that I had to learn. If you have a headset that can plug directly into your mic, so there's underneath this Yeti microphone, there is a connection for a headset. I just choose, I'm gonna be honest with you, it was totally because of vanity. I had a headset that was designed to plug in directly to my mic, and I said I look like a brain surgery patient because it was so massive. I mean, I looked like a space cadet. It was, I said, this is not going to work because it was big and clunky, and it didn't feel, it wasn't comfortable. And it looked awkward. I was like, oh no, this has to go. And these headphones are, they're not cheap.
Right.
They're not cheap at all. I have another really funny quick story to share. So I decided to go back with the most basic USB plug-in type headset, and it's a Logitech. And I was recently communicating with the CEO of Logitech, and I thought I was doing a good thing. Everybody, I took a picture. I said, I leverage a lot of Logitech technologies as part of my podcasting. I have a Logitech camera, mouse, headset. So I took a picture, sent it to him, and he didn't say it. He said it without saying it, but he was like, yeah, we have to look into getting you a new headset. I was so proud of my headset and the fact that I was using Logitech products. And he was like, yeah. So speaking of going back to the basics, my headset is very basic.
Okay.
And he was being nice, but it was his way of saying, oh dear God, you've got to do better.
You may need an upgrade.
Exactly. Exactly. So that's that for equipment. And obviously you have to have a laptop. Zoom is great because you can record that audio as well as the video, but there are other screen recording and screen capturing tools that are out there. This is what I tell people about Zoom. It's not that Zoom has superior video quality or is just a superior product in general. Zoom is so easy to use.
Yeah.
And it syncs so nicely. It integrates so nicely with all of these other technologies that are out there. So Karen, you probably can speak to the process of when you booked a date and time. So I use a system called Acuity Scheduling. Acuity connects to Zoom. So when I send a person a link to book a date and time to appear on the podcast, what Karen did, for example, she went in, she saw a date and time that happened to work out for all 4 of us. She selected that, filled out a little bit more information, such as headshots. And by the way, you want to try to get all of that stuff up front because you don't want to have to be going back and forth in email threads trying to get a headshot. Let me get your bio. Oh, wait, I forgot to ask for this information. Try to get as much of that up front as you can. And you can do all of that in Acuity. And then the minute Karen clicked OK, submit, it automatically generated a Zoom link. She was able to save that to her calendar and probably then forwarded that information to to you, Cynthia and Deborah, and then we were done. And it was literally that easy. Skype is also, I've been on some podcasts where people use Skype. I've also been on podcasts where people use Zencastr, Zencastr, just because they really like the quality of the product that a Zoomcaster recording provides. So just know that you don't have to have Zoom. There are other options that are out there. And I'm sure you also know this as well. With Zoom, you can use it for free, because I had a free account for many years with Zoom. And I would say only because of COVID, honestly, the pandemic, did I finally upgrade, because I had to start doing everything as everyone else has had to do on Zoom. And so obviously you have more people on there. And if you want several people on at a time past 40 minutes, which is the point at which it's still free, then you have to pay for it. So just wanted to mention that. This is the last thing. I definitely don't want to end before without explaining this. This is a schematic that I found online, and it's a fairly decent depiction of what distribution looks like and how you can actually promote and cross promote your podcast. So in the center here, that's actually the logo for Libsyn, which is one of the distributors. This is what let me explain what these symbols mean. So what we have here is Libsyn. So what this diagram is telling you all is, hey, if you connect with us, if you develop a relationship with us to distribute your podcast, the first thing we're going to do is give you this RSS feed. That's what this symbol here is. For those of you just listening to the podcast only, you know what the RSS symbol is. Hopefully, it's like an orange circle with several lines. It doesn't quite make a complete circle, but you get the idea. It's the logo or the symbol for an RSS feed. This symbol here is for Apple Podcasts. This is the Apple Podcast icon. So what it's telling you is, when you upload your audio file to Libsyn, what happens is you're going to tell Libsyn, I want this episode to either go out right now as soon as I click the publish button, or you can say, I want this to go out on October 30th, 2020 at 12 o'clock noon. You can upload several podcasts at a time and set it on autopilot, and you're done. So remember how we were talking about doing your interviews in batches?
Mm-hmm.
When you do them in batches and get them edited fairly quickly, you can then just upload all of them to Libsyn. There is a storage limit per month, but you upload all of that to Libsyn, and then you set a distribution schedule. You may say, I want this one to go out again October 30th. This next episode, I want this to go out 2 weeks later, whatever that date would be, and you select the time. You can get that specific. And then you're done. And what Libsyn is then going to do, well, I apologize. Let me point out one more thing. You also have to tell Libsyn all of the places where you want it to send your podcast. I want my podcast to go to Apple Podcasts. I want it to go to Google Play. I want it to go to Blogger. I want it to automatically be converted into a video on YouTube. Libsyn has that capability. I want it to go to iHeartRadio. I want it to go to Deezer. I want it to go to Spotify, to Stitcher, to SoundCloud, to Castos. These are all of the different places where you can send your podcast. These social media icons, I don't know if this is true for all distributors, but I know with Libsyn, you also have the ability to automatically put out an update to LinkedIn, for example, or Facebook or Twitter, the moment that podcast is published. So when you start thinking about all of the different places where podcasts are streamed, because even Libsyn doesn't offer a direct link to every single podcasting platform out there. There's so many. What I can tell you is this. I recently took the time to, I think it was at least 20 additional podcasting platforms. I submitted my RSS feed to them because they weren't available through Libsyn to automatically push through Libsyn. I had to go and create those accounts and give them my RSS feed individually. And the number of downloads tripled literally overnight. So the more places you distribute your podcast, the better. And another thing I would recommend, the minute you get that specific URL, so let's say when you send your podcast to Spotify, there's a specific URL associated with your podcast on Spotify. Make sure you copy and paste all of those links into a document that all of you can have access to. That way, if someone says, well, Karen or Deborah, I don't have a Mac. I'm not downloading iTunes to listen to your podcast on iTunes or Apple Podcasts. I listen to all of my podcasts through Castos. And you may think, well, what the heck is Castos? But if, maybe Deborah has already documented that in your master listing of all of your networks, and then you can just copy and paste that link and send it to that person and say, hey, you can look for it here, or just go directly into that platform and search for the Back to Basics podcast, and you'll see us. Mm-hmm. And sometimes I've had this happen where people will tell you, well, Apple Podcasts, by the way, they're the dominant player by far. Spotify is quickly catching up though. But they may say, well, I don't consume my podcasts on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. I go to this place. And it may be something you've never heard of before, but that's an opportunity for you to investigate and figure out, okay, here's yet another place for me to send my RSS feed. Something else that's not up here in this diagram, but I think is worth mentioning, my RSS feed also goes to my Amazon author page. So when you create an author page on Amazon, it will ask you, do you have an RSS feed so that we can constantly update your author page with fresh content? So just as a blog has an RSS feed that you can give to other outlets, the same is true with your podcast. So now if you were to go to Amazon.com and look up Alicia Butler Pierre, you're going to always see the latest podcast episode as well as the latest blog post. And it's literally just a matter of sending these different platforms your RSS feed. So I told you this will go by fast.
Wow.
And we're barely scratching the surface, ladies. So here's the thing. There's a lot to do. So something else that I mentioned to Karen in my video response is think about how you're going to divide up the work, who's going to be doing what, because it is a lot of work. But it's something that I know you all, I can already tell you all have a tremendous amount of passion for. Again, you have all of this expertise and this knowledge that you just want to share with the world. And speaking, funny, I would say the world, when you sign up for these whatever distributor you decide to go with, something else to also keep in mind is not everyone will be American that will listen to your podcast. So you may start speaking, for example, earlier, toward the beginning of the podcast, I think I said something, a dollar amount, but I made it a point to say US dollars.
Did.
Because I know there's people listening in 38 countries. And so depending on the distributor that you select, they will give you those stats. They will tell you what countries people are in. And that's how you'll know, okay, it's not just the country that I'm podcasting from. There are people literally all over the world who are listening to this. So sometimes you may have to say things with the caveat of, well, this is specific to Atlanta. This is specific to the state of Georgia. This is specific to U.S. federal law. And you may say, for those of you who are outside of the U.S., this is how I recommend you go and search for something similar in your country. But you'll start, as you start looking at those stats, you'll know when you need to start shifting your language so that you don't isolate anyone or exclude them, excuse me, that's the better word, so that you don't, unintentionally exclude anyone. That was a lot, I know. And we didn't even talk about, I must say, I'm looking at some notes that I had, things that I wanted to make sure I mentioned to you. So really quickly, this is the Business Infrastructure Podcast. So for those of you who are listening or watching for the first time, business infrastructure is simply a system for how you link your people, your processes, and your tools into a cohesive unit so that scale and growth happens in a profitable and sustainable way. So we've talked through a process, but really in the form of a checklist. But as far as the people component is concerned, when it comes to putting in this business infrastructure behind your podcast, definitely think about how you're going to divide the work, whether or not you're going to have an editor. Will you have some type of a show assistant? So a person who can help book the guests, make sure that they have everything, that all of the questions are answered. This is the person who would help do follow-up, because there has to be follow-up after you have your guest on your show. So those are some of the types of people to think about. A great place to go is Fiverr. There are a gazillion podcast assistants, editors, promoters out there, and you'll have to sort through them and kind of experiment maybe a little bit before you find someone you're comfortable with. But if you know that you don't want to get bogged down trying to figure out how to edit an episode, that's definitely a very cost-effective way of getting professional editing. Tools, I must mention, we just won't be able to get into promotion, but definitely check out podcastmovement.com. They have a conference coming up. It was supposed to take place, I think, back in August in Dallas, but because of the pandemic, they are going 100% digital now. So that will take place. I believe the conference is going to take place in November. So check out podcastmovement.com. It's the world's largest community of podcasters. Anything else you want to know about podcasting, seriously, that is a great place to go. There's also another community that I want to tell you about. There's two more. Another one is PodFest. They also put on, I think they call themselves the second largest community of podcasters. But then there's also She Podcasts. And I know they have a very active Facebook group because there are not a lot of there aren't nearly as many female podcasters. And for what all of us are doing in the business podcasting genre, there's even less. The last time I looked at the stat, 80% of business podcast hosts were white men. So there you have it. I know that was a lot. I knew it would be a lot. And there's still, believe it or not, so much more to say. There was a presentation that I did share with you all. I believe it was last week offline. We were talking about how to leverage your podcast as a business development tool. I sent you a link. It was on SlideShare. Did you all have a chance to look at that?
I think I glanced at it briefly. Yeah.
So if you get a chance, now that we've had this conversation, just know that that's kind of part 2 to the conversation.
Okay.
So that really gets into what happens pre-production, during production, and then post-production. So that's where that promotional thing comes into play. But I really talk about all of the different tools that are out there and available for you to use, many of which you can sign up for as a free account and then eventually upgrade to a paid version.
Okay.
So, ladies, breathe.
I know.
Deborah, woosah. Any final thoughts, comments, questions? Do a quick round table here. Deborah?
I'm humbled. I'm humbled.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Cynthia?
My hand is on fire from taking so many notes. And then my little personal comments to myself in the margins, like, you need to. So yes, thank you so much. This was what we needed, though.
We needed
This
this.
is exactly what we were looking for.
And I'm trying to figure out a way to weave in bah. That's an inside joke. That's an inside joke.
Karen, anything?
Well, you have to laugh because now we know how attendees feel when we do our presentations that are 2 and 3 hours, and they look glossy-eyed and like, and you have any questions, and it's like, questions? What is a question, right?
Still trying to absorb everything.
Exactly. So now we're on the other side of it. So now we see, right? That's right. Yeah.
That's hilarious. Well, thank you all so much for patiently waiting, and I hope it was worth the wait.
Absolutely.
Please know if you have any other questions, don't hesitate to reach out. But before we close, please let people know the best ways that they can get in contact with each of you, and also where they can go to learn more about the Business Action Alliance.
So our website for Business Action Alliance is businessaa.org.
Okay.
And then for me, you can get in contact with me at Cynthia Culbreath at awonderfulchange.com.
Okay.
And for me, Deborah Bailey, you can get a hold of me at Deborah, DEBORAH.Bailey, BAILEY, at the name of my law firm, Bailey Helms, HELMS, legal.com.
Okay. And Karen?
And for me, you can get in contact with me. My email address is Karen, KAREN.Mills, MILLS, at millslawllc.com. So that's Karen.Mills at millslawllc.com.
Okay, and definitely please make sure, everyone, that you go out and support the Business Action Alliance. Again, that website is businessaa.org. I'm going to be checking in on you ladies.
Great.
Now we're tethered now. You can't.
Yeah.
So I'm going to be checking in because at the very end of this season, which will be like the last week of December, I am going to be giving a progress report on every single person who's come on this season. So it's going to be so great to track your progress and compare where you are now and where you'll be by the end of 2020. Normally, I'd wrap up by recapping the steps for the process we've discussed on the show, but I think it's best if we talk about this as a series of questions instead. So here are some key questions to answer as you prepare to launch your podcast. Let's start with, what's the name of your show? What type of show is it? What's the description for your show? How often will your show air? Who is the intended audience? What platform will host your show? Will you hire an editor? Will you have a separate website for your show? Will your show be co-hosted? If so, how will the work be split? Where will your show be available? Will you interview guests? Will your show be scripted? How is your show formatted? Will you have advertisers or sponsors? There's so many more questions to ask, but those give you a really good head start in getting your podcast off the ground. Sounds like a lot of work, huh? It is, but it's totally worth it. The best thing to do is to focus on your listeners. Give them value through quality content and production, and they'll reward you with subscriptions, 5-star reviews, and recommendations. Karen, Cynthia, and Deborah have to work through the things we've discussed, but I'm confident they'll pull it off without a hitch. What do you think? How soon do you think they'll launch their podcast? My guess is that it'll definitely happen before the end of 2020. But there's only one way to find out for sure, and that's by subscribing to this podcast and to our YouTube channel at businessinfrastructure.tv. When you subscribe, you'll receive a notification when the last episode of Season 10 premieres, and that's where I'll give you an update on their progress. In fact, you can even request your own private one-on-one consultation with me. We'll also have links to the resources mentioned during this episode in the show notes. Again, all of this is available at businessinfrastructure.tv. As always, thank you so much for tuning in and for being a loyal subscriber. Remember, stay focused, be encouraged. This entrepreneurial journey is a marathon and not a sprint. Until the next time. Thank you again so much, Deborah, Karen, and Cynthia. I really appreciate. Deborah gave the Queen Elizabeth. I love it. She's royalty. Yes, yes, Deborah. Yes.
Yes.
I love it.
Carry on then. Carry on.
Love it.
And on that note, we are going to wrap this thing up. Thank you again so much. And I hope it was, again, well worth the wait.
Well worth it.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you
Okay.
so
We
much.
Thank
appreciate
you.
your
Thank
Thank
time.
you.